Into our next session for today. And I'm very conscious that, our generation, we inherited a planet with complexity, with lots of moving parts, with lots of advances, lots of technology, lots of opportunity, lots of convenience. But we use a lot of energy and we produce a lot of carbon. And that's now becoming more and more obvious. I don't know if you heard the news this morning, but Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, has announced, if we don't hit net zero carbon by 2050, we're going to pass a whole series of different tipping points that won't allow us to find our way back. And we know, and it's been interesting, we've looked to young people to wake us up to this, in terms of being woke, but being alert, to say, well, what are the challenges? And sometimes this is dismissed as, oh, that's just eco-anxiety. But it's a very real threat to all of us. If we lose our home, we're in huge trouble. So we've two speakers to open up this topic, and let's have this discussion. So our first speaker we're going to hear from this morning, and it's one of the US contributions, and it's Dr. Gary Belkin. And I met with Gary in New York a number of years ago when he was leading on Thrive in New York City, where he managed to secure an $85 million budget and ran 54 different programs across schools and with educators and with police services and local communities, mobilizing a conversation on mental health. But more recently, Gary's been heading up the Billion Minds Institute, and the focus is very much around climate, the impact it has, and the relationship this has on our own mental health, our own communities, and our need to care for our planet. So I think we're going to see Gary's video in just one moment. But the video is about 20 minutes, and then we'll be having a conversation with Sara as well. So we'll just watch Gary Belkin, please.
So briefly, what I'm going to try to convince you all and rouse you to think about how to do is to see all of our care systems as part not only of standing up and facing up to the consequences of the climate crisis, by how it's going to make everything worse for what we're doing, who we're doing it for, the forces that are sending people to us for care. But it also, on top of that, is summoning us to reckon with the degree that our care systems have been too distant from caring for the social fabric of societies. We know a lot about how to do that, but partly we've been relegated to micro do it and not macro do it. And the time has come, and the climate crisis demands it of us, that we fight for, learn, and scale the ways that we take what we know to reach further in society so that we create caring societies. Because we know that we cannot nurture the planet if we do not nurture each other. And our community has something to do to make that not just an aspiration or rhetoric, but operationally real and politically resonant. And that's our task that's demanded of us from the social crisis and the climate crisis. So what do I mean by that? So I don't assume that anybody has the same climate, meteorology, geology, literacy. So I'm going to do a very quick Climate 101. So this chart, which I can't point to you. Can I point to you? I can point to you. Are different curves of reduction, the pace of reduction in gas emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, the burning of fossil fuels, gasoline, oil, the pace at which we need to reduce that over time, the years on the bottom, in order to stay within keeping the Earth's mean average temperature at a certain level of increase from about 200 years ago, all right? So the blue at the bottom, the steepest curve, is the rate at which we have to reduce gas emissions in order to keep the mean average temperature of the Earth rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. You may have heard that target thrown around a lot. The two higher curves are to keep it at 2 degrees Celsius. The highest curve is more than 3 to 4 degrees Celsius range. What curve do you think we're on now? The top. So, and I don't know if folks have been, the New York Times reported today on a UN report that said that the pledges to get onto these curves are not being met by countries in terms of emission pledges. The key thing to see here is the steepness of the curve as each year goes by, right? Because the idea is to get to 50% reduction to the 2050 timeline by 2030. It is 2023 almost. The steepness of the curve, this inflection point going downwards to stay at 1.5 degrees was at 2020. We're already almost 3 years behind. Every year out, that steepness drops, and the physical impossibility of sticking to 1.5 degrees looms larger over the next couple of years. So that's why you often hear about the urgency, 1.5 degrees, and so forth. But I want us to look at these curves as something else that's meaningful to what we do. And part of what we all should do, and I'll say it out loud, is to not vote for anyone who doesn't take that blue goal seriously. But beyond doing that, which we join with other people, we also, this gives us a particular task, because these curves I would call not just Earth climate crisis curves, they're social climate crisis curves. Whether it's the blue curve, the massive adaptation of changing how people eat, where they live, how they work, how they get energy, how the economy works. I mean, just think what COVID did to our heads, what that transition is going to be like social psychologically, social cohesively, let alone what's in store for us if we stay where we are in terms of damage, the damage and trauma from what's happening to the Earth unraveling that will have similar but different effects. I'm not going to go into just how bad it looks if we stay on that curve. It looks very bad, and there is not a single elected official, blue, red, Democrat, Republican, who is truth-telling on that. But I'll just say 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees doesn't sound like much, but if you just see these color bars in terms of the degree of damage by these measures, which you can't read, but there are all sorts of things, like the desertification of southern Europe, probably of large swaths of the west and southwest of the United States. These are in decades, not in the end of the century. This is in front of us. South Asia, West Asia are now going to peak this decade in their availability of water from ice melt, which is most of their availability of water. It's all downhill after the next couple of years for a part of the world where 350 million people live, right? So these increments matter. But it's the social climate part of it that I want to talk about. One is what it's going to do to people to live through either one of those curves, as I mentioned. Because we know weather events, drought, disruption, displacement, they all markedly elevate all sorts of issues that bring people to us, right? And I will confess at the outset, I come from a mental health background. I know that line of work better. So some of my examples and references may be more in that track. But it's really all care systems here. We are dealing with vulnerable people who are going to become more so. I understand you all are going to be getting this PowerPoint in the app or something, already in the app. So you'll see these references, so I don't have to go through them. But there's tons of evidence about those direct impacts, and I'll call them typical impacts. The mental illness diagnoses we're used to treating and people coming us for, all escalated. But what I think we must do as a care community is to go beyond that illness burden, which will grow, and finally reckoning with our role in the social damage burden that that illness burden both causes and aggravates and reflects. And that is getting much more attention now as people start thinking about, quote, the connections between mental health and climate change. A couple of years ago, if you read most literature on that, it was mostly about the, more depression, more trauma, et cetera. Huge problems that our current system as organized cannot handle. So we have to re-engineer what we do anyway. But what's really interesting is not only within the mental health profession and more activist around climate, but whole other areas, institutions, disciplines, are waking up to the fact that that is a massive social burden coming down on us. And I personally feel COVID had a lot to do with that realization. So if people follow this kind of thing, United Nations Development Program, they do a semi-annual series of reports on human development in the world. They report on it. For the longest time, a lot of those metrics were about GDP, economic growth, education, completion, the usual sort of signals of development. Their issue, just recently out, was completely about mental distress. They define mental distress as one of the leading obstacles to humanity navigating the future. This is extraordinary. This is a summary diagram, which you can't see the details of, but just sees a lot of stuff. Toxic stress, environments, pro-attachment behaviors, just everything. How all those things are aggravated by changes in the environment, changes in our political environment, changes in our disinvestment in both democracy and participation in public goods across the globe. How all that fuels into these red things, more mental distress. But importantly, how more mental distress fuels back to aggravate all those other things. And I think that's the part of things that we as a care community really have to pay more attention to, is not just the way the world beats people up to come to us, but how much what we do helps shift the culture, the impacts, the realities of societies that beat up people. We can change that balance. We can create caring cultures. And that's in fact what the Human Development Report calls for. We have an economic system, we have a social system, we have political systems that commodify people and Earth together in synergistic, reinforcing ways, and that cycle of destruction has to end. And the human element part of it is partly our job. Macro policies, income, stabilization, equity, there are all sorts of macro policies, but there's also ground games that have to contribute to reversing these cycles. And there's some real good scholarship on this point, again, from other disciplines. Economist Carol Graham, among others, if you read one book, read that one, in terms of this body of research from economists showing that a lot of what we debate publicly about, that we call as economic policy problems, like intergenerational poverty, is intergenerational trauma. It's intergenerational despair. It's intergenerational hopelessness. And we have a lot to do to mend that and to interfere with that and to voice an end to those destructive cycles. This is a great summary of itemizing evidence out there on the mental health impacts of neoliberal policies, the degree that we've disinvested in public goods, that we have both our political culture and our economic culture magnify each other as being very much about everyone is their own bottom, zero-sum sort of, you have to do everything yourself kind of culture. Eroding community, eroding the real well springs of human development and well-being. And so we have to stop talking about those policies as economic policies, but as harmful public health threats. All these threads come together in a great book. Sally Weintraub, a psychoanalyst who has written the book Psychological Roots of the Climate Crisis, where she pulls all these things together, including the way she uses this notion of care. That it's not just a kind of empathy between people, but it's work in creating the cultural conditions where that becomes the norm of group practice. And that is how it is reflected in our politics and in our economics. And we can fight back from the bottom up to build those cultures of care. So for us, as care providers, as on the ground, as in our neighborhoods, as the handholders of people facing these dizzying, conflating crises, is part of our job, and particularly coming from a mental health perspective, is we got to get into not treating people who come to us in this bottom left of the curve. In this case, a profile of the spectrum of mental health, from folks with mental disorder to people who are flourishing. Our job is not just to sit here in the corner waiting for people to come to us after waiting for 3 or 4 months, but to push the curve over to the right. And that means a lot of things. That means re-engineering our work, where we do our work, whose hands we touch, what allies we have to extend the reach of what we know and what we do further to the right. But it's necessary social fabric building that we have to be part of, not just because there's a climate crisis coming and we're all going to fall apart, not just that, but even without that, you can't make a dent in the population prevalence of depression or anxiety or substance use without doing that. This waiting in the corner business never worked, and so we should have always gotten into the psychological resource building business, but now we really need to. So the good news is that there are actually a lot of good real-world examples of efforts to do just that, to re-engineer the work so that it reaches further, it reaches people earlier, but it also invites, and I love the conversation this morning when Arthur was talking, and you had shown a quote up, which I'm not going to get right, but that every neighborhood knows their own solution, right? And a lot of the comments when we were in the room were about nothing about us without us, co-creative work, a horizontal way of figuring out what to do. So there are really great examples of that, which reposition formal systems of care instead of the receiving end as a special kind of partner to their community. So I'll be concrete. So I was, when Arthur was the commissioner in Philadelphia, I was in New York City, developed something called Thrive NYC, where the idea was that most of the work, or more of the work, has to be outside of mental health clinics. This was a mental health focused program. And I learned that by working in the global south, working in sub-Saharan Africa, working in the Caribbean and Haiti after the earthquake, where there was this growing field of global mental health that realized, most of the tasks, the evidence-based tasks of prevention, of care, of promotion of mental health, of resilience building, the whole spectrum, most of the skills can be done by non-clinicians, often better because they're closer and more credible to people who need them, and the value of the professions is to be a coach and partner and backup to those other members. So each one of these dots in this map of New York City is actually a geocoded spot. This isn't just visualization as a graphic, where we had a specific program where we were reaching people through other places. So none of those dots are mental health clinics. They're elementary school rooms, they're job training programs, they're daycare centers, they're homeless shelters, they're police precincts, they're primary care practices. They're all over the place where we were skilling up those people, but partnering them with someone to help them out. The 100 Million Healthier Lives effort, if people don't know it, look it up. This was an effort to build community coalitions, again, with clinical systems as partners, where they frame the strategy, set the aims about how they improve well-being in their community, which by itself was an engine of care, an explosive, credible, quite inclusive engine of bringing people together to problem solve in ways that our politics is completely driving people away from each other. That led to a Wellbeing in the Nation network. They have metrics. They have hyper-local work that is doing their own, sidewalk kind of efforts, measuring well-being in their communities, measuring depression in their communities, measuring trauma in their communities, and then targeting approaches and ideas to reduce it. So there's this thing called the Race to Resilience, just getting back to climate, which is sponsored by the United Nations, that is trying to mobilize civil society to do climate adaptation work. So to really bring community level, grassroots level, as well as local governance and lots of other partners to do adaptation work around climate change. What that means is solidifying physical infrastructure, sea level banks and preserving, electrical systems and transportation systems, kind of the hardware stuff. So I went to them with an organization I formed called COP Squared and said, which is now a 250 organization network, global north and south, across the global. It's a global organization that's working on this interface of mental health and climate in this very community resilience building way. And we said, you can't have resilient places without resilient people. And so you need a mental health lane. You need a people's resilience lane. And they agreed. So I got to schlep to Egypt in 2 weeks for the next COP and announce with Race to Resilience that they're going to have a people's resilience lane. COP Squared is working over the next year to write a roadmap of how they do it. And how they do it has to be in this very participatory, on-the-ground, multiple dots of work kind of way. We know enough to put in those dots. There is tons of evidence, which I won't go through here. You can look at these references, but we know what to put in the hands of those people in those dots that helps them take care of their neighbors with depression, with trauma, with anxiety disorder, to reduce the prevalence of those things in their populations, which I have not seen done in any other way than in this way. That bring in this great book, The Nurture Effect. All sorts of ways that schools and workplaces and community centers and YMCAs can do things that promote resilience, that promote attachment, that promote mental health. And the way they do them is inherently inclusive and social bonding and collective efficacy power building. And I'll just end with there that I think at the end of the day, we can't be timid that we're onto something. We are onto a secret sauce about actually how democracy should work. I've gotten really interested not just in the idea of participatory democracy or deliberative democracy. You may have heard of things like citizens' assemblies or citizens' juries, where questions are put to random samples of people from an area to deliberate on. They're given objective information, which is the key thing. And the research shows that they actually come, and people who came in the room with very divergent views can come to consensus and often to progressive and actionable conclusions. There's never a science to that. But they're also, when you read about it, when you read what they expect people to be able to bring in that room to do, it's to be able to be perspective-taking, to be able to express themselves, but in a way that's safe and respectful, in a way of asserting what they need, but appreciating limits and the value of mutuality. They basically list things that you will see in the Nurture Effect book, that you will see in any developmental psychology book, that you see in when I learned, one of the greatest initiatives that we did that I learned got real traction was under Thrive and OIC, is we brought early childhood psychologists into early pre-K daycare and child care centers in New York City, which had high adversity facing families there. And the kind of skills we were trying to help them bring into their homes and into their environments were the same sorts of things that Carol Graham talks about as making the difference between the despairing and hopeless and those who move out of poverty. There is a convergence that is psychological, that is about the components of caring, that is not just individual, but really has to become cultural and political. And we can re-engineer how we do our work to make that the new normal. So, I have 2 questions for you. And I'm going to do a little different than Arthur is going to do. I'm going to make you work at a little more pace because the pace of climate change is just forcing this, all right? So one, and we'll have about 10 minutes, is for you to just share reflections about this broader kind of challenge to our systems to re-engineer its work into dots, other ways that we are closer to the ground and we are capacity building of social fabric. What does that sound to you? Does that sound weird? Does that sound possible? Does that sound great, but how do we do that? Does that sound, oh, I heard about that, or whatever that sounds like, to hear what that sounds like. How would it affect how you might lead your organizations to aspire to that kind of role? And then we'll hear a bit And then I'm going to go back to you and ask you a very pragmatic question. This roadmap for the race to resilience that we have to write, we intend to build a very widely consultative process. And we really need in the geographies that this is going to work. And by the way, the aim is to reach 4 billion people by 2030. This is a really ambitious effort and opportunity to spread what we know to get into dots like that on the ground globally. But we need to energize provider systems of all shapes in all these places to be partners to this kind of work. How can IMHL, IIDL be a network that helps propagate and energize and elevate providers around the world to step up to that challenge? So first we'll start with question one, your reflections on this, and second, what can our organizations do? And do I say like go? Start with the first question. How much time will we have for that? 8 minutes, 8.5 minutes, and then we'll do a quick canvassing, and then we'll get to the second question. Thank you.
So that presentation was in Washington yesterday, so as I say, we're being invited to rejoin that conversation. But we want to bring a European perspective, and I'm really, really pleased that Sara Langeveld is joining us this morning. So, Sara, you've been described as a young activist. Now, I wasn't described as a young anything, by the way, so we'll have a word about that later. Microphone on? Aha. I was sitting on the microphone, which is probably not a broadcast for early in the morning, okay? Sorry about that, guys. So I was just noticing that in the program that Sara's described as a young activist, and I wasn't described as a young anything. So it's been a while. But I think in terms of Gary's describing there just the global impact, and sometimes when we have a conversation about climate, it's a bit like when we're having a conversation about traffic. And we're saying the traffic is terrible this morning. And we're saying, well, you are the traffic. So we're inclined to push it away, either into the future or away from us, or it's someone else's responsibility. But Sara, you've a huge interest in this area. And tell us a bit what excites you about this topic and your need to take action.
Yes, well, first of all, let's introduce myself. I'm Sara. I think I'm the youngest one here. I'm 20 years old. I know that's a bit scary for you. Yeah. So I'm having a bit of a cold, so sometimes I will take a sip of water. But I think there are some things that might be important for you to know about me. First of all, as you said, I'm very involved in the whole climate thing. I mean, it's about our Earth, so for me it's very logical to be. But I've been climate striking in high school. And then after that, I went to the United Nations in 2019 to join a global conference on climate change. I was representing Dutch students there. After that, I became involved in the Dutch Youth Climate Movement, which is like a big organization in the Netherlands. Next to that, I'm also very interested in mental health. I have quite a lot of lived experience. I've been quite depressed in high school. I've had some problems with eating, anxiety, that kind of stuff. And recently I discovered I have ADHD, which explained a lot. And I also was a board member of the Dutch National Youth Council, where I also was very involved in mental health because, well, obviously it's very important to me. And I was also on national television to talk about it and stuff like that, so that was very cool. So why is it important for me, you ask? Well, for me it's very important that everything is like sustainable, so that it can endure, that it can go on. If that is not possible, it's obviously not sustainable. And I think that has two sides for me. Mental health, if you are not okay, or it's not sustainable the way you are working with yourself, you feel yourself, you are living your life, that's not sustainable. But obviously another part of it is like we need to take care of our home, our planet, and we must make sure that what we are doing is not causing so much harm that we are not able to sustain our own home. So that's why it's very like obvious to me that everybody should like panic, but I mean, that's a very unique view. I recognize that. So yeah, that's why I think it's so important.
Yeah, and I think sometimes there can be a temptation for people to have a huge urgency and then tip into panic.
Yeah.
And we had dinner last night, and that was really interesting. You were describing how activism itself needs to be sustainable. You know, it has to be realistic and groundable and achievable.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So I am a bit more like realistic, as you said, about the whole activism part, because, well, at some point I was really trying to take into account sustainability in like every second of my life, which meant for me like constantly thinking about how can I be more sustainable. Okay, I need to take the bike instead of the car. I need to do this instead of that. Oh, I can't buy any plastic, but there's plastic everywhere. What do I need to do? So that is obviously very, very, it's way too much to take. So for me, I've come to a little bit more of like a flexible approach to make sure that I actually can be sustainable with myself. So maybe my way of living right now is not as sustainable for the planet, but it's more sustainable for myself, and I can like live this way for a longer period of time. So therefore, it's also in the end more sustainable for the rest of the planet. And I feel like activism is a bit lonely sometimes, as well if you're like very, very, yeah, you know, progressive with your thinking, because you're like running and running and running, and then you look behind and you see, oh, there's nobody following me and nobody understands where I'm going. So I might need to like slow down a bit to get people with me. So I think that's also like a very important part of activism.
So there's a key lesson for leadership there in terms of leadership without followership is not really useful. And making sure you have traction and people understand where you're going next. And it was really interesting when you're describing your options for coming to Dublin. When you researched out, okay, what's the greenest way to get here?
Yeah.
And it wasn't necessarily particularly convenient or economic.
No, yeah, so that was also a big issue for me because, yeah, well, I came here by plane, which I don't like. Well, I like flying, but it's not very good, right? So it's like for flying here for like 2 nights in a hotel, it's not great. So I talked to Vivian about it, like, is there a way to go here by train or by boat? And I took a look. It was very, very inconvenient. It would take like 14 hours to get here from Delft, which is where I live, to Dublin. 14 hours was the minimal amount of time, but then I would have to travel like the whole night, so I wouldn't get any night. Well, I would lose like a whole night of sleep, not very convenient. Or I would like take another route, but then it would be like 24 hours, which obviously is not very convenient as well. Like, and it was so expensive, it was crazy. So unfortunately, I had to fly, but it was, yeah, taking into account that kind of things when like going through a congress or organizing a congress, I think it's very important. We talked about like the meal yesterday as well. That was a point for me because I'm vegetarian. I don't eat any meat. Okay, well, except when I'm really drunk and I like eat some doner. I need to confess that. Yeah. Okay.
A very rare event.
Guilty pleasure. Guilty pleasure. I was like going through the doors and they said, "Yeah, do you want like fish or meat?" And I was like, "Do you have a vegetarian option?" And they were like, "Oh yeah, we can put you on the vegetarian list." But I was like, well, first of all, why is it not like one of the 3 main options? And second of all, why is it like an opt-in to go vegetarian, not an opt-out? It would be make so much more sense to be like vegetarian all the way, unless you really want to meat. I mean, of course, you might want to eat meat, that's fine, but it needs to be opt-in instead of opt-out.
Yeah, and I think it's probably answering one of Gary's questions there in terms of what can we as an organisation do, and it might be one of the learnings we want to integrate ourselves. And it's not just virtue signalling, but signalling and gestures are important, but they have to be substantive as well.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
And Sara, in the Netherlands, I suppose you've begun this conversation probably back in the 1970s and moved beyond conversation into actions. So I've never been in a more cycle-friendly country with excellent public transport links, and people have a naturally green outlook. How do you think that was achieved in the 70s that probably the rest of us are only catching up with in the last 5-10 years?
Yeah, I think for me it's very that's probably the most frustrating thing for me that you're now touching upon, because I feel like all the knowledge that we have has been available for such a long time. So we could, if we started then, we could just gradually like adjust to the new way of living. But now we have to do it like very abruptly, which is very like inconvenient. But on the other hand, I mean, we're still talking about human beings here. We can't really, well, climate change, it's becoming a bit more tangible. Like, for example, in the Netherlands, we had lots of flooding last year in Limburg, one of the regions. But it's still quite intangible. So it's very obvious that you become occupied with like daily life, daily stress, and that you don't see the bigger picture as much. I think that is why it's so important that like politics, they manage the bigger picture, right? They should like take into account that bigger picture, because we can't ask of everybody to like act upon and see the bigger picture all the time.
Yeah, and I think sometimes your geology can shape your thinking in terms of, you know, if you live in a country that's prone to flooding, acting singly is not terribly useful. If I raise up my home, I actually imperil my neighbour. So when we work together, you get better outcomes. So I think your geography can shape your thinking and shape your behaviours, and indeed political decision making as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and the like in terms of, I suppose, like when people are faced with sudden and radical change, there can be a sense of thinking, well, it's too late. You know, we should have done this. Like, you know, when's the best time to plant a tree? About 30 years ago, and the next best time is today or tomorrow. So sometimes this argument's been put forward saying, listen, it's too late, just enjoy yourselves, go to hell in a handcart, and you know, it's all over. So why struggle with that? That can actually induce people into hopelessness and helplessness. So how have you managed to avoid that?
Well, sometimes it's hard. I do definitely agree with that, but I feel like, well, I'm not very optimistic about that we are going to get like to the 1.5 degree. I don't think we will manage to fix that, but still, like every 0.1 degree, it's very different. Like if we manage to get like 1/10 of a degree, and with lower, that is already very good. So I think we should save what we can. What we can. It's not really about like, oh well, we lost. Well, okay, maybe better next time. No, we should like try to keep on going and do the best we can do. And if we don't invest now, obviously we need to have a lot of climate adaptations. For example, flooding. If the sea levels rise, we need to improve our water management, for example. So if we don't invest and work hard now, we can do it tomorrow, obviously, but then we have to make sure that we are like preparing for tomorrow, because otherwise that will be like, oh, whoa, we didn't expect this. No, well, you didn't take that much action today, so you know, it will have consequences.
And in this session, we're looking at in terms of the climate crisis and a social crisis.
Yeah.
And people are making that connection. I think Gary has described there in terms of, as habitats fail, people have to abandon their areas. It's no longer a space that can live. And you get migration, you get conflict, you get a range of things. But it tips over very quickly into how people live their lives, how poverty and sustainability. So you've explored this topic as well in terms of the relationship between climate change and people's mental health and how they feel in the world.
Yeah, I think it's, well, thinking about myself, when I was depressed, I was very busy with being depressed. So I couldn't really think of anything else except for my own misery, which is very, very logical, of course. But I feel like and this is not only with climate change, but I think with a lot of problems, if you don't have like the mental space to think about, like I just mentioned, the bigger picture or the people around you, or if your work is meaningful, or if you're happy, blah, 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 all those like big things, obviously you won't worry about the climate. So I think there are many ways to like link climate change or the climate crisis to like a social crisis or whatever you want to call it. But I feel like if we manage to get people more healthy, mentally as well as physically, we will be able to handle the climate crisis and probably like the consequences of the crisis a lot better, because we will be a lot more resilient, as Gary mentioned as well. So I think it would be great if everybody feels very happy and very comfortable with themselves and has very secure social environments, because then we can like work together a lot better to, for example, solve the climate crisis.
Yeah. And I think one of the things we're becoming more and more aware of, I suppose, is nature and biodiversity in terms of, this is our natural habitat. This is how we evolved. And as a mental health device, and to make sure people are fully engaged in communities, I think maybe during COVID people discovered the outdoors a little bit more than they had. But the programs like we have in Woodlands walking programs has really allowed people to appreciate this is a better pace rather than an urban context. So I think that plays into the whole climate conversation as well. People begin to really appreciate we need to protect this and not take it for granted.
Yeah, definitely. For me as well, I think when you felt very locked up in your own house, then you really appreciated that small walk that you could take to go outside, especially if like the sun was shining, or even when it rains, you were like, oh yes, I can go outside of my house. So that's great. But I think it also touches upon like a deeper need for humans to be to like slow down their pace, which is very hard. But if you look like at our brains, we are not made for this world. We are still with our brains and like gathering the food and like I don't know, eating mammoth and that kind of stuff. So this world is not really made for our brains. So it's very hard to make an argument to go back to that civilization, I think. But it is important to take into account, like I just said, that we are dealing with human beings and that we should try to understand our brains or our needs to make sure that we live a good life that is not like that not only like is rationally good, like we have a lot of money and we can do everything we can, but that is actually like good for our brain and like emotionally good for us.
Yeah, no, and it's just that regulating back in nature really works well. And again, sometimes we talk about nature in the third person as if it's a distant phenomenon, not us. So it's it's really important there. I think sometimes technology is floated as a solution. Yeah, we'll engineer our way out of this. We'll find a way to make this work. Would you be confident, and even if it's possible, is that the route we should go, that you can carry on doing damage and repair it afterwards, or build higher flood walls?
Well, I think technically it could be possible to do it technically, but I mean we talk a lot about this in terms of mental health as well. It's better to like prevent or even like promote mental health instead of oh no, you're depressed, okay, let's give you a medicine, okay, that will solve the issue. I think it's like sort of the same in these terms. So we should do what we can to make sure we are sustainable in the first place, so that we don't have to do a lot of damage control, because it's the most obvious thing to do for me, at least. So I would say yes, we obviously need technology. That's not a question for me. But I feel like we should mostly use the technology to like be smart and sustainable in our like normal way of living, not for repairing the damage afterwards.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I suppose sometimes to mobilize people and get the conversation happening, sometimes there's a sense that people can be guilted, but that's not always a great motivator. You might get a sugar hit off that, but it fades fairly quickly. So I think Gary was describing there maybe roles like citizens' assemblies, and describing Arthur Ashe's work in Philadelphia in terms of where neighborhoods know their own solutions. Have you seen models like that work?
Yeah, I think I really liked that he was like with all the, you mean the map with all the dots on it? Yeah, I thought that was brilliant, because it really showed how much different kinds of initiatives can actually contribute to mental health. He was like also mentioning like police, which I was like, oh yeah, of course, police could play a role in this as well. So I think it's, which makes it a very, very hard task in my opinion, but it's more about the whole, system, I don't think that's the right word. I think network might be a better word, like the different factors that can play a role in this whole discussion, and that can play a whole role in mental health of like your community. But for me, those terms and those words are always a bit intangible, like network, system, factors. Yeah, it doesn't always say that much to me, honestly. But I think if I think about myself, for example, Like I have ADHD, like I mentioned, that at my university there is like an initiative to help students with a disability, which, I mean, ADHD, yeah, it sucks, but it's very nice sometimes as well. But disability, not sure. If I get my medicine, it's most of the time, it's great, actually. Those kind of things are very nice, but the hard thing is to get like a full overview of it, because it's, for me, I can name like maybe tens, maybe even 100 factors that contribute positively to my mental health. So if you have to do that for everybody in like in the community, and not to mention like what is the community, how big is that? That's very hard, I think.
Okay. Well, let's ask this community in terms of making that connection between climate and what's described as a climate crisis and our mental health. And we might need a microphone. Chance is going to pick one up here, and Catherine. So, just yourself first.
Thank you. I'm Caroline Vink from the Netherlands. Is it on? Yeah, I think so. I have a remark and a question, and I don't think it's fair just to put it to Sara, because I think one thing we see with this topic is that it has been the young people that have been taken the adults accountable for what is happening now. And they, I think, very aware of the fact that they will be the adults of the future, and also thinking about their children and their children. And so maybe also to point out, I don't know if everybody's aware of it, but it's also being discussed at this moment as a children's right. So the UN Committee of the Rights of the Children is at this moment doing a big consultation and wants to publish a general comment on climate change in relation to children's rights. And I think we should take that into our minds, that we cannot be excused not to do anything, because they are really holding us accountable. So at this moment, also all the countries that are going every 5 years to the UN committee are being asked by the committee, what are you doing on climate change? And so on quality of air or all other things. Because one thing we see, and I think this is probably my question that is to this whole community, one thing we see also from research is that climate change has a direct impact on the mental health of children and young people, and also leading to fear for the future. And I mean, it's probably in the most extreme case. And I think it's calling for not just sort of thinking about it and talking about it, and it's also a social issue. So I'm actually focusing more on the social issue and not on how Gary mentioned it, the hardware, about what we can do or if we can still change around. Because I think, to be honest, I think the reports are there. There's no turnaround anymore, so we have to deal with it. But one thing I think that asks from also the mental health community is what kind of answers do we have? And I think the answer is that we need some kind of, well, we call it the pedagogy of hope, and how to do that. But I think hope needs action. I mean, I think hope just by itself, I think also the young people tell us, yeah, nice, but that's not going to help us. So I think what can we do from the mental health perspective to actually give some tools or some action to this kind of pedagogy of hope.
And I think you make a really important point, and I think Greta Thunberg addressed it at the UN when she was, how dare you look to me to resolve this and our generation to fix your mess. So I think our generation and generations before us have created this mess. We can't excuse ourselves. And I think sometimes projecting into the future.
That's I think also why I think we should not pose those questions to the young people. They will help us find the answers. But I think it's all of us who need to think about this. And I think also from the mental health perspective and profession, I think there could be a lot of answers if we want to put that together. And it's more than bringing the community together. I mean, that's more than, I think that those are all conditions that are being needed, but I think it's time to give some action to hope.
I've discovered recently, and I think it's in Wales, they have a commissioner for the future, and all legislation that's been passed must be viewed as what's the impact of this on not just the people who are voting today or might vote in the next 20 years, but well into the future, 40, 50 years hence. And I think it's, if you look at Seligman's work about learned helplessness, if you're in a situation that appears to be impossible, it can deflate, it can de-energize, and you give up. And we simply can't afford it, as Sara has described there. Isn't this it? Sorry, John, yeah?
Hi, thank you. It's Antonis Koussoulis. I'm Director of the Mental Health Foundation in the UK. I have a similar point, and I'm wondering if this is useful as framing, and perhaps Sarah's thoughts on that. You said something about if we are healthier and we're more satisfied with our lives, we can be better activists, we can care more about climate. I'm wondering what you think about the opposite framing. Many of us know that working in very disadvantaged kind of neighborhoods, that if we teach young people about using their voice and being activists, this can be protective against the trauma that they are facing. So could this be a useful framing for us as a community, mental health community, and maybe for you in your activism? This is protective for our generation of young people, using their voice, being activists. It's good for their mental health, and perhaps this is a good starting point for us. So your thoughts on this framing?
Yeah, I think that is a very good point actually that you're making. I really think that touches upon having sort of meaning in life, which obviously is a very promotive and protective factor, I think, in mental health. And it's really interesting actually that you are saying this, because when I was going to the UN, it was in September 2019, it was actually a very... I was very surprised actually when I came back, because I was realizing in March maybe that year, so basically half a year before the summit, that was honestly the worst point in my life. So I was at my lowest at the time, and half a year later I would be more or less recovered from my depression, and I would go to a climate summit. So that is quite surprising. Well, it was to me, but I think it really was also that my recovery accelerated enormously at a point, because I found, for example, meaning in the whole climate debate. I thought, yeah, this is something that it's bigger than me. It has meaning. If I can contribute to this, wow, it powers me up. And even though it's it tends to get a bit negative, honestly, in the whole climate debate, oh, it's a bit too late and it's so hard, blah, blah, blah. But still, I'm sitting like this, right? If it would be very boring, I would be like this. So it gets me fired up, So I think having meaning in your life and having a goal that is part of something bigger, it really is very good for your mental health. So I think that is an excellent point. Thank you for adding that.
Okay, we'll come back to Thomas then.
Okay. Oh, thanks so much, Sara and Gary. I'll send him some text later on. This is a great, very, very, very pertinent conversation. I think there's been some really interesting developments, I think, also from particularly actually the United Nations Development Program around these things. They did a report in 2020, the one before this one, looking at human development within the context of Anthropocene. What they were able to do there was to connect the fact that we've never ever been able to do social progress within planetary boundaries. So we have to find a way of getting a chance to really develop as humans within the context of planetary boundaries, and together with, between us and also with nature. And one of the solutions that they're proposing is actually, how do we change fundamental values around the stuff? So what they're doing is that they put into a quote that I'm using almost all my lectures, and they say that if we're able to understand that equity, stewardship and innovation is what is meant to lead a flourishing and good life, then those things can be connected. So the question for us is, how do we make a values conversation between generations, within generations, between everyone, where we really think that those elements around equity, stewardship, and leading a good life, not buying the next car, is what brings value to our lives. So I think that's super connected to everything we're doing in mental health. It's everything to do with what happens in the development and wellbeing budgets and those kind of things. So we should just get much more engaged in those kinds of conversations, in my view, and we have a lot to offer and a lot to learn. So wonderful conversation. Thanks.
Thanks, Frederick. So that was a Swedish perspective, and I think Nigel has a question there as well. and then Thomas.
Thank you. Just reflecting on how change happens, and I'm thinking about the sort of system shocks that we've had. So COVID shocked us into a different way of working. We'd been talking about it for years. We could maybe have more working from home and so on, but suddenly we're thrown into it. And now it's become more accepted in the way of working. The next system shock we're facing is the price of gas and oil. And suddenly we're thinking, how do we save electricity? So we seem to be very selfish as people, and only when it directly affects us do we start to make change. What are the next system shocks that we need to actually make those changes?
So that's your question to me. What are the next... Oh, well, that's a big question, honestly.
Lean forward, lean forward.
I'm going to grab my glass bowl. Wait a moment. No, yeah, honestly, I don't know. I really don't know. That's a very good question. So if you know the answer, please tell me. Well, I think, like I mentioned a few times before, we are human beings, and the whole problem is not in like how do we save carbon dioxide and or like emissions and that kind of stuff, but it's like how do we change our behavior, and that I think is why it's so important that we understand the human brain a bit more if we really want to get into those transitions. Which, well, I do think there's like maybe some bad part about understanding the brain more because it can be used very, very badly. But I think we are in a transition, and transitions take a lot of time. So as I mentioned, you need those front runners, and they will go in the front, and people are like, oh, great, they are crazy, they are only wearing their socks made of, what is it, sheep wool and that kind of stuff. And then you need people that actually break down the old systems, people that build new systems, and people that connect those things to each other. But it just takes a really, really long time. So, as you mentioned, if there is a system shock, we will have to adapt to it. So I think that if we don't do very good, and we might get to those 4 degrees of warming, of global warming, then there will be a lot of system shocks that we need to react to. And we will just have to do that. I mean, if the whole country is flooded, yeah, you can't just say, oh, well, I'm just going to watch Netflix. That won't work. So we need to take action at the moment. But the point I'm making is that if it's possible, we should take a little bit of preventive action and promoting action before we need to cure the things, which is the same case I'm making for mental health, which is basically the whole thing I see is that is sustainable. So if we can manage to do that, that would be great. If we don't, honestly, I'm very privileged, I'm white, I am highly educated, and I probably will have enough money later to figure out things for myself. But I'm mostly, it's like a principle thing for me, because I know there are a lot of people that don't have the opportunities that I have, and they will probably die. So it's like a matter of principles for me to take action upon this. And I hope with these kinds of conversations that actually I think spark a lot of energy, because it's like discussion about values, not about things that are more on the surface, but it's about our core deep down values that actually might spark that change a bit more, because you're energized, and then you have energy. Even though you're maybe tired, you still have energy, like mental energy to do things.
Excellent. Okay, we're going to take maybe 3 more questions if we can.
I'd like to add some terms that might help to formulate shared visions and shared language. And first I want to mention to the lecture of Gary. In fact, he discussed complex systems. And climate is complex, mental health is complex. This is complex systems thinking. And complex systems thinking contributes because it also focuses on adaptive capacities of systems, climate systems, but also of communities of people. And in the Netherlands, we embrace the positive health model, and that's also one of our challenges. One of our challenges in this network, it's normal that we think about recovery and we think about the social determinants of recovery. But in the external environment, it's not normal. In the Netherlands, it's not normal. The medical dominant is still dominant. And in the positive health model is a nice model to embrace the 3 dimensions of recovery: symptomatic recovery, social recovery, personal recovery. And your remark, Sara, about focusing on climate, it's too much, you also need to look for yourself. This framework is also supportive to visualize a shared focus on adaptive capacities of individuals and of networks. So in the Netherlands, we are embracing this positive health model and we are implementing it at the moment also in municipalities. I'm using it in my research of home service users. It's have a look at it and see if it's helpful in formulating in local networks a shared focus to embrace and to book progress.
And I think it's a really well-made point in terms of sometimes when things are very complex, it seems more convenient to go with a simplistic model. And sometimes we see perhaps irresponsible political leaders simplifying complex topics, saying, and the more certain people are, usually it's a sense of how less informed they are. So it is a complex phenomenon, and I think Sara's described that too. Thomas?
Yeah, just in terms of connecting to a point that Gary made earlier on about, the neoliberal model that we are operating in, which, minimises the role of communities and individuals, and increases the power of large corporations in the pursuit of profit, including large drug companies, and contributes to the disempowerment of individuals, and how decisions are made about how we organise society generally and the services that we have. Is it possible to achieve climate change? The question I would have, or indeed equality within such a model. I know that's a big question, and I know it's a large one, but I think it's a really important one that we do see the larger society that we're operating in and how things are organised at a macro level and how the changes that we can make, because I think we're all part of.
And I think it is a really big question, and I suppose the temptation is to run away from that. But I suppose there's a moral imperative here, and even if it's just enlightened self-interest, we can do better, and fora like this allow us to understand different perspectives in a more complex way. I think we have a question down towards the back. Thanks, Sean.
Yes, it's a fantastic conversation. Firstly, there's so much input to be gained here. I have a question and a train of thought focused more towards the IMHL as a whole and the social crisis part of the climate crisis. It was a very fantastic presentation by Gary as well earlier, where with the ongoing climate crisis, we already see a huge social problem erupting, where people have to migrate their homes and the devastation that is caused. I'm originally from Pakistan, and I think you might have heard in the news as well, the floods in Pakistan that are quite common right now. And one of the elements that comes in from such devastation of climate is that people have to leave villages and smaller towns and go to cities, like bigger urban areas in third world countries or wherever they live. My comment and question comes more from an international leadership of mental health standpoint, that at this stage there are 1 billion people in developed economies, Europe and America, North America, but the remaining 7 billion are in the rest of the world where there are not enough resources. And we already struggle trying to build networks in developed economies, which we see right now, how to build integrations between different European countries. And talking about a preventable crisis, it's a very visible crisis that social migration will happen in the next 30 years. So a comment would be that if you're trying to build more global leadership and global networks, then can we already start taking steps that we connect this European intellect and knowledge of mental health and bring it to the countries where we foresee a crisis is going to come first?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question. And I think it has an extraordinary topicality, because even though the news cycle has moved on in Pakistan, the country's still underwater. And our colleagues in Australia, in New South Wales, are underwater. So this is very real and very immediate. And I think your point about being Eurocentric or Americentric, you know, even from a gearing perspective, 1 billion versus 7 billion, where are you going to get the best return? Where are you going to have the most impactful interventions? And I think it's a point really well made. This is a conversation that everybody wants to participate in, and there's going to be lots of time to do that. We've just one final question just to bring this session to a close, because we'll be breaking for teas and coffee shortly. And I know Catherine wants to talk to you about the room for the breakout as well. But we're really pleased that one of our speakers from later, Maria Walsh, who's an MEP, has a question to close the session.
Thank you very much. And Sarah, I seen you down the hall earlier, and you took the stairs while I took the elevator. And I'm not going to lie, the shame when you got up on that stage is really living well. But on a very serious...
You don't have to be ashamed. That's not necessary.
I'm living in my shame, and it's okay for me to be living in my shame. I should take it. But on a very serious matter, and actually picking up from the previous question. I'm really fascinated by consumer behaviour, and you mentioned behaviour changes. I think essence of this is a common thread of education also, and I really acknowledge and I welcome the fact that you shared in terms of privilege, because I often do that too, particularly when I speak to younger people, to look beyond what's in front of us, and I would love to hear your thoughts on what it is, well, I can do in the European Parliament, but what I can do as a consumer and in rooms like this, when we talk about food security and our climate. And I sometimes really believe that, you know, I walk into a grocery store, and I come from a rural background and a part-time farmer, and I really sometimes believe food comes from shelves in a grocery store, and that's inappropriate. Correct or inappropriate and incorrect, and we've become so desensitized and to the impact it has around the world, food waste, food security, as I mentioned, water consumption, and the fact that the fast fashion world, and to make one pair of jeans is 1,800 gallons of water, one t-shirt is about 400 gallons of water just to make the cotton, to make such things. And to the previous question, it is other countries that are bearing the brunt of that. And sometimes I really do feel we have become desensitized to it. It is often this climate world, crisis, emergency, it is so out there and not here. And as consumers, what we need to do on a daily basis in order to make those changes. And I'd love to hear, a long-winded question there for you, apologies, but I'd love to hear where we balance that, where we are very proactive and progressive in change, but also don't lay blame on people to make sure those are coming with us. Because I know from our farming community, you know, the narrative is often, well, we're getting blamed. Well, it's not actually. As consumers, we have to take our responsibility in that. So I would just love to hear your thoughts, and thanks very much for fitting me in.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Well, first of all, balance. My therapist said something very inspiring to me. You don't have balance, you search for balance. So first of all, let that sink in. Well, I think for consumer behavior, I think it might be good to at least calculate the real price of things, which is not good for my own wallet as well, because my groceries are so expensive. But I think if the price would also take into account, for example, the emissions caused by producing the food or the clothes or whatever, the true cost is a lot higher. And I think it's first very important that we try to engage everybody in this whole debate, in knowledge about it, because it is not really top of mind. So I think spreading awareness is first and foremost a very, very important thing. And if you are privileged to have that knowledge, I think you should take responsibility and act upon it. Because, I mean, I would like to party every night. I would like to get drunk every night, but it's not possible. And I think it's the same with, for example, maybe flying or eating meat or whatever. It's very good, I think, to enjoy life sometimes and I mean, be happy, do the things that you love. If that's eating meat or, well, bigger picture, like eating out or traveling around the world, those things make me very, very happy as well. But it needs to be in moderation. And I think it's very hard to talk about this because you get very offended very fast. For me as well. Honestly, this jacket is from H&M. It's also fast fashion. But on the other hand, the trousers that I'm wearing, those are sustainable. So I think it's more about the balance, about doing whatever you can and doing that one step at a time and changing in that way your behavior instead of, okay, cold turkey, I won't eat meat, I will never fly again. It's just not possible. And that is not sustainable in the long term. If I would say to you, you can never eat meat again, nobody would listen to me. So that would be most sustainable in terms of the planet, but you won't do it, so it's not sustainable. It would be more sustainable for me to argument, which I'm making a case for, to do things in moderation, to take those steps one at a time, and it's probably not going fast enough, but it's better than nothing, right? And I'm at the point right now that I'm not overly optimistic about human behavior because it's very complicated and people won't listen and they will not do stuff that is like the best for themselves as well. I mean, getting drunk is not very good for you, but it is possible to take those small steps for each and every one of you. I think just one thing a day or one thing a week, it's not that hard, but you have to be aware of the things that you can do it. And I think that is the difference between consumers and, for example, the supermarket. Consumers should try to do to take the best choice. For example, eat vegetarian. But for example, supermarkets, they could don't do discounts on meat to promote buying those vegetarian meals, or to put those in front of the store instead of the back of the store. And there are I'm studying business, so I know something about marketing. I just finished a course about that. There's a lot of ways you can influence consumer behavior. It's quite scary actually, but we can use that for good. I mean, if we have the knowledge, let's better use it in a good way. So I think very long answer to your question, but I think that is really shows how complex it is. But you can do something.
So folks, this is a conversation we can continue to have, over coffee in a few moments, but just to thank Sara for her extraordinary wisdom and maturity and being able to take these questions and contribute to this conversation so effectively. So Sara, well done, thank you very much.
Thank you.